Hello and welcome to Control-F, the NSI Cyber and Tech Center's new podcast that features season-long groupings of issues at the intersection of technology and national security. Our first season of Control-F is focused on game-changing technologies through a set of 8 episodes released every other week over the course of 4 months that take a deep dive into key emerging technologies that are reshaping our world and the ever-evolving tech policy landscape alongside them. During each episode of this season of Control-F, we're featuring one or more leading technical experts in a given field, as well as one or more key investors funding the development of these critical technologies. So today we'll be talking about generative AI and closed source large language models. And we have 2 awesome leaders in the field to talk about the game-changing nature of this technology. Dr. Natasha Jaques is a senior research scientist at Google DeepMind, specializing in social reinforcement learning, a field that merges social learning and multi-agent training to enhance AI agents, learning, generalization, coordination, and human AI interaction. Dr. Jaques holds a PhD from MIT, where she worked on effective computing, deep learning, reinforcement learning, and machine learning. Dr. Jaques also serves as an assistant professor at the University of Washington's Paul G. Allen School of Computer Science and Engineering. Dr. Jaques' work has been recognized with numerous awards, including the 2021 Outstanding PhD Dissertation Award from the Association for the Advancement of Effective Computing, and multiple Best Paper Awards at prestigious conferences, including Neuro-IPS, ICML, and the like. Dr. Jaques' research has secured significant grants, including the 2021 C3 AI Digital Transformation Institute's AI for Energy and Climate Security Award, an award that highlighted her contribution to the field of AI. Mike Brown is a partner at Shield Capital and a visiting scholar at the Hoover Institution. Mr. Brown is currently an advisor to the U.S. Navy's inaugural Science Technology Board. He previously served as the director of the Defense Innovation Unit, DIU, at the U.S. Department of Defense from 2018 to 2022. DIU fields leading-edge commercial capabilities to the military faster and more cost-effectively than traditional defense acquisition methods. During his tenure, DIU introduced 100 new vendors to the Department of Defense, fielded 50 new capabilities to the military, and increased the transition rate of fielded capabilities to practice at 50% as well. While at DIU, Mr. Brown created the National Security Innovation Capital Initiative, an effort to catalyze private investment in more deep tech hardware startups. From 2016 to 2018, he was a White House Presidential Innovation Fellow and co-authored a key Pentagon study on China's participation in the U.S. venture ecosystem, a study that ultimately catalyzed efforts around the Foreign Investment Risk and Review Modernization Act, FIRMA, which was signed into law in 2018, and which modernized the Committee on Foreign Investment in the U.S. to focus more carefully on China. Prior to his public service, Mr. Brown was the CEO of Symantec Corporation from 2014 to 2016, at the time the global leader in cybersecurity and the world's 10th largest software company. He's a former chairman and CEO of Quantum Corporation and the chairman of Equal Logic. He received a BA in economics from Harvard and his MBA from Stanford University. So, folks, let's get right into it. Dr. Jaques, let's start with you, right? For the last year and a half, the world has gotten to know generative AI. It sort of kicked off in the public consciousness back in with the release of GPT 3.5 in November 2022. But you know, as you well know, it began long before that, right? So let's just start with the basics, right? What is generative AI, right? How do large language models work, right? And how is this technology sort of fundamentally different from or isn't fundamentally different from what came before?
Yeah, great question. So I think at a very high level, what generative AI is doing is taking a huge amount of data and training a model to be able to replicate that data. So in the case of a large language model, you try to scrape basically all the text you can get off the internet, and you feed the text in kind of token by token, or if to understand it like word by word, and ask it to predict the next token. So in doing that process, it learns to model this data, and then you come up with this model that basically can simulate text data in a really convincing way. And you asked about how it's different from the technology that's come before. I would say this is part of like a larger wave in machine learning and AI that kind of started arguably in around 2012, which is about deep learning and neural networks. And these are a particular type of AI technology that basically has connections between weights in the network, and they are meant to kind of imitate human neurons. Input comes in, the neurons decide how much they want to fire to the next layer of neurons, and you update the weights between the neurons based on seeing some data. But you can think of it as just a way to train on a large amount of data and kind of compress that data into this network. And this kind of deep learning revolution that kicked off in 2012 is different from more classical forms of AI. But in terms of how GPT is different, and the history of work in deep learning, it's really not that different. It's just extremely scaled up, way more data, way more compute. But it's actually using techniques that were developed earlier, like in 2017 or earlier than that. Yeah, so for folks that are, I think, in AI, we've seen more and more and more impressive results and started getting more and more excited. But somehow GPT 3.5 is really what broke into the public consciousness in a very serious way.
So as we think about this, I mean, in a lot of ways, is it just word guessing? Is that really? I mean, because it feels very conversational and it feels real, right? And so when you tell me it's basically just a really fancy way of word guessing, and if so, we've heard a lot of the ideas about like reinforcement learning and the ideas these models are sort of training themselves, right? And then we've heard about generative adversarial networks. We've heard about retrieval augmented generation. There's all these phrases out there, right? But is it really, when you cut down to it, is it really just a fancy word guessing machine? And if so, how does it become so colloquial? How does it become so familiar?
Great question. Okay, so the basic underlying technology is just guessing words. So a large language model in itself is just trained to maximize the likelihood of the data. So when you put in some question or some prompt, what it's trying to do is come up with a response that just sounds plausible, given all the text that it's heard before or it's been trained on before.
Yeah.
And the problem with this objective is there's nothing in that objective that stops it from making stuff up, lying, saying something that might be biased, right? Because guess what? There's a lot of biased text on the internet. And if your only objective is to kind of say something that sounds realistic, there's nothing in there that's constraining it to say something that's true.
Right.
So a key difference in the way ChatGPT or GPT 3.5 has been trained is with this reinforcement learning from human feedback. And this is actually something that I worked on very early and is a key part of the research that I do. But basically, it's you have the language model generate a bunch of responses and you have humans rate whether they're appropriate, whether they're biased, whether they're truthful, helpful, harmless, these kind of criteria. And you learn a model of what the human would say for any given piece of text. And then you use reinforcement learning, which is the technology I work on, to train to optimize the responses according to that model. So essentially, you're trying to make sure that the model adheres to what you think the human feedback would be. And that is kind of the primary way we do safety, alignment, and fine tuning of these models.
Interesting. So at the end of the day, you still are relying on humans to guide the model in the long run. But once the model is set and you've had enough human input, then it can sort of generate the kind of both appropriate and accurate responses by and large. So then where does this idea of hallucinations come from if these models have been, have taken a bunch of data in, right? They've been trained on that data. Humans have guided them. Right? They're now doing reinforcement learning and they're getting feedback in real time. Why do we have this problem of hallucinations? And is it here to stay? Is it going away? What's the deal?
I think it's still a pretty big problem. So the issue is I can train my model of human feedback, and the human can do a limited number of responses where they read it and they say, was the model lying in this case? But that's very expensive. You have to pay humans to do that. And inherently, that's going to be quite limited in scale compared to like all the text it's ever seen on the internet, right? And so your fine-tuning process with this human feedback can only kind of address so much. And how do you guarantee that no response from the model is ever going to be a hallucination? That's a really tricky point.
Yeah. Well, so Mike, I want to talk to you a little about the national security perspective, because you've come out of DoD, you were in a major company before that in the cybersecurity domain, and now you're investing in this space. And look, I mean, generative AI is taking the world by storm. We've heard about it in the defense context, the intelligence context. It seems to be a co-pilot out there for everything we're doing. And a lot of us, believe that the technology is going to be transformative. It's going to be a tide that raises all boats. But there's a lot of folks out there saying, well, we need to be careful here. There are leaders in the field who've suggested that you ought to treat the capabilities and behind AI as sort of, equivalent to nuclear weapons or a global pandemic. I think it's an interesting question, right? What are the risks here? What should we be worried about, both from a sort of domestic risk perspective, but from a national security perspective? Should we be worried about our adversaries getting a hold of it? You're active, you're investing in the space. How do you see the risks that are in play and the opportunities?
Yeah, well, this is like so many technologies that have come on the scene that, can provide tremendous benefit to humankind, but also have risks. So I don't see it as a very different. Cybersecurity is exactly the same way. How could we operate in today's society without the digital means we have and the access to the internet? But we also see there's dangers there as well.
Right.
This is one of the biggest achievements, I would say, that we've seen in the last century in terms of technology development. Because AI, as Natasha was indicating, has really been around from its research origin since the 1960s. I think that's when DARPA started working on the concept of AI. And of course,
Right.
we've seen it migrate through very, brittle rules-based architectures and so forth. But now it's really achieved a game-changing, to the title of your show, game-changing status. So I'm very excited about what the potential is as a productivity tool for almost all fields. It really has tremendous potential, but there's also some downside, and we're just learning to work with it. Natasha talked about one of the biggest limiters right now are these hallucinations. So if I can't trust what these models are telling me 100%, that I have to be careful about where I'm going to use it. But I think we're just early days. It will improve. I feel confident we're going to solve that problem. Don't know how yet, but it will get solved from a technology standpoint. And then we have to start thinking about what are the safeguards that we want as a society. I think there is a place for a regulatory framework here, but much more excited about the opportunities. And we're already making some investments in the space, as many venture firms are. It's almost half of the investment space that we see today in terms of capital that's deployed by our firm.
Well, I do want to talk about this potential for a regulatory framework. Before we get into that, though, Natasha, talk to us about, as you're working on the cutting edge, right? So Mike says, look, I think this hallucination problem is going to be solved. That was sort of where I was, I don't know, 3, 4, even maybe 2 months ago, right? But I've heard more and more recently, there's been a lot of public discussion about maybe we're not going to solve the hallucination problem. Maybe it's just with us forever. Maybe in some ways, hallucination is a form of creativity. We've got enough data in, right? And it's pulling new ideas together. They're wrong, right? Or we think they're wrong, right? But who knows? So talk about how you're in the commercial field as well. You're not just a research scientist, at a university. You're actually in practice at Google. How do you all think about this risk and opportunity dynamic? And do you think we have the potential to solve these larger sort of hallucination problems down the road, or are they just going to sort of stay with us, perhaps in a different form?
Yeah, I think I'm always hesitant to speculate too much on the future because it's very hard to predict. But I feel like if I were making bets, I don't know that we have an immediate way to solve the hallucination issue. I've seen proposals for like integrating AI with a knowledge graph, which you can fact check, and then it can kind of pull from the knowledge graph. You mentioned like retrieval augmented generation, where you give it kind of a bank of facts that it can pull from. So there are techniques that people are working on. I think it's pretty hard for a large language model that's just been trained on a massive amount of data to really prevent that. But as you mentioned, and as you alluded to, like maybe we don't need to, because there's so many use cases where even if the model occasionally gets it wrong or is hallucinating, it can still accelerate people's work pretty significantly. Like if you imagine generating code, I've already seen like even my students can code faster because they're using like the autocomplete code feature. And it can actually write a lot of the code for them, and they just make corrections. And this is kind of in line with how we've seen this deep learning AI technology be used for many years. So like it was quite a few years ago that we were able to, more accurately predict cancer in radiology scans than a team of oncologists. Wow. But it can still get things wrong if there's a weird artifact. So the way that this technology is often used is integrated in the workflow where a radiologist or a trained human can check the results, but it can accelerate their work. So kind of this human in the loop way of using AI, or as you mentioned, like using it as creative tools, like it can help, stop your writer's block, right? Or it help with generating music for artists. So I think there's a lot of use cases that are unlocked before you even solve the hallucination issue.
Well, it's interesting because we ran a war game at Mason. We just released a report about it. And we did a human, sort of National Security Council meeting. It was a Taiwan scenario. And then we ran the exact same prompts that the humans had through just commercially available ChatGPT 4.0. And it was interesting because what we found was that the AI had a set of ideas that it came up with that were different than the humans came up with. Not all the time, but sometimes they were very similar. They had a few new ideas, and the humans actually told us later on that had they come up with those ideas, they actually would have implemented some of them. And then the humans sort of freelanced and took ideas from their own historical, knowledge base and applied those in this context in a way that the AI didn't. And so the combination of the two might be really the potent way to think about it. So Mike, what about that? Like, is the real use case for AI not sort of automated weapons and sort of Skynet, with drones killing people in an automated fashion, but instead as an augmentation tool for human operators, whether it's in the military or the intelligence community? And if it is that, what about the sort of hallucination challenge when it comes to making intelligence assessments, making military decisions, right? Even if a human's in the loop or on the loop, right? Either making decisions based on it or interrupting it if they need to. Do we worry that the hallucination problem is big enough that we can't trust it in this high profile, high importance domain like national security?
Well, I think there are so many applications in national security before you get to kind of the most dangerous scenarios that you just pointed out. For example, you'd never want to design some generative AI based system that's controlling nuclear launch capability. And understand that came up in the discussion between President Biden and General Secretary Xi when they met out here in California not that long ago. So there are certainly those cases where we're not ready to be applying AI. I think everyone would agree with that. But before you get to anything with that kind of dangerous kinetic possibility, there's so many applications where large language models can be useful. And frankly, AI even separate from large language models. And we're seeing that all over the place. Just at the time I was at DIU, which is 2 years old now, we were working with Google on a project that Natasha alluded to, which is how to use the visual information, computer vision, to get better at spotting cancers. Just an incredible use of that technology, because we all know AI is better at detecting signal from noise. Another example was a project for NORAD. So the sensors are more valuable. There's more information coming from existing sensors if we can apply AI to it. Analogous to the situation or the example we just talked about with cancer was all of the sensors that NORAD used, which were not tied together, believe it or not, unlike the movies we see with a very large screen of North America.
Right.
So we were able to use AI to show individual sensors which exist have more sensitivity, or we can get more signal from that, and then knit them together using commercial software to get a common operating picture. And we changed the balance in that with the NORAD commander, where there was a lot more time to analyze what you were seeing, as opposed to what had existed before, a lot more time just trying to figure out correlating the signals. So great examples, everything from medicine to defense, where it can be incredibly valuable. Having said that, yeah, we're not ready to use it in the most sensitive situations yet, where human lives are at stake. So we have to be very careful right now with hallucinations. I think that makes that problematic. But while I don't have the answer to the hallucinations yet, I tend to be an optimist and think that over time, this technology is brand new. We're going to figure that out.
Yeah. Natasha Jaques, one of the things that we've seen or we've heard a lot about in the last maybe 6 months or so in this rapid development is this idea that that perhaps the AI can test itself, right? It can use inference to get better at learning, right? And it can learn from the results it's providing and apply it sort of in a backwards way. Am I saying that right? I think I'm saying that wrong, and I want you to sort of help guide me here and help our audience understand. As we think about how to solve some of these problems, we want to apply AI in the national security context. We want to get past some of these challenges, right? What are some of the leading edge capabilities that researchers on the front lines are thinking about to improve the quality, the scope, the nature of generative AI, particularly as it's using these large language models, OpenAI's ChatGPT 4.0, Gemini, Claude, Anthropic's Claude 3 Opus. These are all, how are they getting better over time besides just adding more data in?
Yeah, I mean, more data is a big part of it. I think we're also innovating on training and architectures and stuff. But what you were mentioning maybe is using AI to kind of critique itself, or even do kind of like letting it have chain of thought is a famous innovation where basically if you let the LLM kind of have its own private thoughts and spell out the steps, the reasoning steps it's taking to solve the problem in text, then it can solve more complex problems, which is really interesting. And in my own work, I've seen that if you are using an LLM in sort of a social context, like a dialogue with a person or a user, if it's allowed to have sort of private thoughts where it can reason about the user's intentions, then it can actually do better at the social task as well. So actually using the output of the language model itself to then build on that and construct its solution to a task. And then there's also, I mentioned earlier, we rely on this fine tuning step to make sure the LLM is more safe and unbiased, and that requires human feedback. But of course, human feedback is extremely expensive and actually noisy as well. So there's this new wave of research, which is having the LLM give the feedback. So for people that are listening that are curious, you could look up constitutional AI from Anthropic, where you basically give a constitution to an LLM, tell it, hey, we need all the responses to be safe and aligned, and then it can critique and rate the responses of a different LLM, and we can use that as feedback. So it's quite interesting. That's definitely a predominant approach. I think there's some reasons to be cautious about this, right? If you trained your LLM on the entire internet, which is known to result in a model that is biased, sexist, racist, it has all kinds of problematic issues with it, and then it's the one critiquing the LLM to improve it itself. Does that truly work? How can we tell? How can we make this more safe and transparent? I think there's reasons to be concerned, but it is definitely a wave of research that's being done.
So that's interesting. So one thing to be concerned about is maybe the critique, the sort of the social critic or the LLM critic is actually problematic in and of itself. But what you're describing sounds, this idea of private thoughts, this idea of a model critiquing itself and improving on its own as a result. That sounds pretty human-like, right? It has these elements of almost sort of, and it feels like maybe we were putting an anthropomorphic view on it, right? But is this sort of, are we approaching this idea of artificial general intelligence, and is that on the theoretical roadmap? And if so, should we be worried about it? Because a lot of people, there's a lot of talk about AGI and the robot overlords. Is this overblown, or is this something we should really be thinking about and concerned about? And if so, what, if anything, should we be doing as we're looking at this rapid innovation?
Yeah, I think AGI is kind of an overloaded term, but I do think there's a lot of people that are AI experts that I respect that are actually very concerned about the possibility of basically AI getting so good or accelerating so quickly that it's extremely disruptive, I would say. And I think we're already seeing that, right? We talked about AI unlocking more productivity for people, but it's also been extremely disruptive to the education system, right? You can no longer assign a take-home essay because you can just get ChatGPT to write it at graduate level quality that is undetectable, that it was AI written, right? So that's upending the education system quite quickly. And how as a society do we adapt to these technologies rapidly enough to cope with it? Yeah, in terms of AGI itself, definitions vary about what it is. I think there's quite a few people in Silicon Valley that would say it's already happening. I think the definition I tend to use, which is maybe a little bit more cautious, is to say AGI is AI that's better than humans at everything humans can do. So truly general, the everything humans can do is doing a lot of work in that sentence. We're not there yet. If you look at where we are with autonomous driving or autonomous household robots, we're so far from seeing that working. And I can comment on why I think that is. But some folks, and especially I think kind of the OpenAI, community of researchers tend to use a more digital only definition of AGI, where you can make it a technology that works only on digital platforms that's so transformative that, it's really upending society. It's so disruptive. So how do we cope with it?
Well, so Mike, I saw you chuck a little bit about whether we're close to AGI. So I want to come to you on that. But before we do that, Dr. Jaques, I just want to clarify one thing. So you mentioned that there are these different definitions of what AGI is, and they're not necessarily good in the real world. But there's this digital idea that we may be close to it, maybe almost be there. It's really good at coming up with answers to things and can do it in a very human-like way. But are we at the point where even this digital version, are we nearing the point where this digital version of artificial intelligence, of generative AI, could in fact sort of start doing things on its own and maybe sort of escape the constitutional bounds that we give it? And if so, is that something to be worried about?
Oh, I see. Is this like a Terminator Skynet
Yeah,
kind of
that's the
question?
Terminator Skynet.
Okay.
Right? I mean, this is the problem, right? This is the thing that
It always
people-
goes there.
It always goes there, right? I mean, this is what people worry about, right? I mean, people worry that. I mean, look, there's that poor DoD colonel who laid out a thought experiment, and he said it like they had done it, and where the alleged drone turned on its operator because its reward function said, do whatever it takes to get the target. It was all a thought experiment. All the newspapers covered it like it was real, like a drone had killed an operator, an AI run drone, and could kill the operator. And they all had all the major publications had to retract that article. But that's the kind of world we're in. So is this something we need to worry about, or is this just way overblown and like, come on, like this is not Skynet is not the near future?
I don't think Skynet's the near future. So basically, what we would be worried about there is, like you said, an AI that's been trained on seemingly one objective, but in trying to optimize that objective goes way off script and does something really dangerous, right? Currently, the way these systems are used is they're not just operating autonomously to optimize some unknown objective. They are trained on this like human feedback objective, but usually it's like you do a round of training, you stop, you deploy the model. So it's not like constantly updating itself online. It doesn't have the ability to kind of do something like that. There is a whole community of people that are concerned about AI safety that think about what would happen if we did have a system that's online, optimizing some objective, particularly with reinforcement learning. Reinforcement learning is where you give it a metric and you just tell it to optimize it and you let it go. This is like when people talk about the paperclip scenario, this is what they're concerned about. So the AI is told to make paperclips and it melts down the whole world to make as many paperclips as possible, right? People do think about this. If you're interested in reading more about that, I would check out Stuart Russell's book, Human Compatible, because he has like a nice layperson friendly book about this. I still think that's a little bit far off because we don't have these systems operating autonomously trying to do that. I'm more concerned about the more proximal problems of bias that exist already, to the extent that you have these large language models integrated in a bunch of products like search, email, etc., that are already biased. This problem is facing us now. So that's what I spend time worrying about, as well as the fact that the technology could just improve so rapidly that, like I said, it's extremely disruptive. But not that it's going to be the Terminator.
Got it. Okay. So Mike, I saw you sort of, I know you want to jump in here. Talk to us about how you see this artificial general intelligence problem. And you put on the table earlier this question of regulation and a potential regulatory framework. Tell us what you're seeing, what you're hearing in the sort of government domain, in the national security domain. How do we expect this regulatory framework to play out? And I know that there's this new AI national security memorandum that's supposed to come out from the White House here in the next few months. Talk to us about how you see that whole process playing out, and then maybe a little bit about what might happen on Capitol Hill.
Okay. Well, I think my views are pretty aligned with what Natasha laid out. That I'm more worried about what humans do with the tool than what the tool is doing on its own. And we have that danger with lots of technology. So I'm more worried about somebody using the tool to figure out how to make a bioweapon than I'm about machines creating that on their own. And this is a problem you have with, cyber technology and others. It's just how powerful large language models can make that a little bit scary. But that, to me, doesn't take away from how exciting the possibilities are, how much this can improve all our lives, standard of living, and has important national security implications as well. We're investing in a company called Houso that is focused on explainability. Because we think that's going to be pretty important, and that's one of the important characteristics. Another investment we're making is.
What do you mean by that? Tell us what you mean by explainability, because I think a lot of our users have heard that phrase. But what do you mean? And I'm going to ask our Jaques what she means by explainability.
As Natasha kind of alluded to this before, the models are pretty sophisticated and come up with things you might not have thought of. Some would say that's creativity. Now, I didn't comment on the AGI. I think we're very far away from AGI.
Right.
In the digital world, you'd have to already concede there are things that, are happening at much better than human capacity. No one would argue as an example, that the computational capability of what we're able to achieve with computers is way ahead of what humans can do. That's a fact now.
Right.
So you're starting to see this in a couple of more domains than pure mathematical computation. That's where I think we are. But we're far away from, intelligence in the computer AI model that's better than everything a human can do. So very much agree with Natasha there. So explainability, as these systems come up with things that are creative, you want to know, well, how did you get there? So because there are hallucinations, models up to now have been brittle. So you want to make sure that the model you're getting, the result, is something you really can explain and is rational, at least as we would understand that term. So explainability is going to be important. Another firm that we've invested in, Gnostic AI, is looking at how do I restrict the prompts? Because if I'm in a company, as an employee, I shouldn't be able to ask what are the earnings next quarter or tell me what my boss made. You want to make sure that you have some control over that. So I think the limits, the practical limits, are going to be important. There's software that's going to be helping with those, which are some examples I just described. There's probably, just like in the cyber world, what we're going to want to do is make sure we cannot be at the fault of prompt injection, folks going in, altering the training data. There's a lot of dangers here that can come from malicious activity, but that exists, as I said, with any technology. I don't think there's something unusual here that we need to be worried about that's separate from any malicious intent with other technologies.
Yeah. So Natasha, how do you see the future of sort of generative AI going forward, both in the near term and the longer term? And what are the things that we should be thinking about, be concerned about? As we think about, there might be potential regulation coming. We saw the president had a, 100+ page executive order. There's this AI national security memorandum coming down. There are conversations on Capitol Hill. There's a group of 4 senators on the Senate side, and then an AI task force in the House that are looking to potentially put some, framework in place. What are the things to be concerned about? What are the things to not worry so much about? And where's the future of this technology going in your mind?
Yeah, I think one thing to be concerned about, and also adding on to Mike's answer, is I think this whole wave of technology that's based on neural networks and deep learning is super powerful, as we've seen, but it still has this fundamental flaw where it's really not good at giving you a reasonable answer if you give it an input that it's never seen during training. So we call this the problem of generalizing to something that it hasn't seen during training. And this problem isn't very apparent in the language space, because if you've trained on the entire internet, it's pretty hard to find some text that it's truly never seen. But there was a really fun tweet, which was actually from Noam Brown, who's a researcher at OpenAI. And he was talking about how LLMs are much better at playing chess than they are at playing tic-tac-toe. And tic-tac-toe is a much easier game. But the reason is people spend a lot of time on the internet writing about chess strategy, but not about tic-tac-toe. So they're really only good at doing things that they've been trained on. So this looks fine in language land, but when you try to make something like an autonomous household robot, and you don't have as much data about being a robot, or even self-driving cars, we've had a lot of self-driving car accidents that are caused by going outside the distribution of training data that it's been trained on. So there was a Tesla accident where there was a semi-truck carrying a semi-truck carrying a semi-truck, and it caused an accident. And, Andrei Karpathy was like, I've never seen a truck on truck on truck. So the problem is, if it isn't in the training data, your model is going to fail. And this goes back to Mike's answer about adversarial attacks. There was a nice thing with LLMs where someone just found out that if you type the word poem into it 1,000 times, that's so out of the training distribution that it'll start revealing private information of personally identifiable information that has been trained on, to Mike's point. So of particular people, this is the home address of this person. So there's definitely some issues that are not solved with these technologies that I think require further research, and we have to figure out how to cope with them. And then in terms of the regulation, I want to go back to the bias point. If these models are being trained on unregulated whatever you want from the internet, there's some really toxic content there that we may not want to have in our models. And then I want to actually say one other thing, which is the fine-tuning process. You're supposed to fine-tune these models according to human values. Whose values?
Right.
Right now, the way this is done is OpenAI or whoever curates a bunch of labelers and trains them to have very high inter-rater agreement with OpenAI values that they are dictating, or Anthropic values that's dictating the Constitution. What happens for if there are a minority group of users that have a different preference than the majority group of labelers, that preference will just be ignored or overridden. So these models are not able to accommodate diverse and different values and preferences and align to those. So that's something that we're actually working on in my lab, technologies that can do that more effectively. But yeah, I think that's a real problem as well.
Yeah, and that minority viewpoint could be something that we might view as very toxic, or it could be very beneficial, right? That's one of the challenges, I think, in this space. So Mike, as you're thinking about this from a national security perspective and a technology innovation perspective, there's this talk about potential regulation on Capitol Hill. You might regulate the data that goes in. You might regulate the technology itself and the compute capability, or require reporting, as the president's CEO did. Where do you see it going? And do you worry that some of this regulation might hamper the rapid pace of innovation we've seen? And then the last piece of it, what's the role, if any, of investors in sort of helping with the regulation, helping sort of coach where their companies are going and guide them as well, particularly in a world in which, we're in a pretty serious competition, not just in the AI domain, but in a lot of domains with countries like China and Russia that might not share our value system.
Yeah, great point. I think that is the key factor in terms of how fast we need to be going with the technology, because we are in a race with countries that have very different value sets than we do. I think we should be very careful about limiting the ability to proceed. I very much disagreed with a group of Silicon Valley luminaries who said we should stop all development for 6 months. I think that's crazy. Not only could you not enforce that, but we are in a race with other countries here. So I think the U.S. and its allies continuing to be at the forefront of the technology, and thank goodness this is something that shows the American innovation at its best, that we did come up with this first as a country. We want to continue that, promote that, continue to work with allies in this space. Then we also need to think a little bit about how we want to be limiting the use of the technology. And maybe that's with some of the technology that limits prompts. I think the companies developing the models should take some responsibility for not only how do we work on correcting hallucinations, but what can these be used for? That's going to be a very tricky area. I don't have all of the corner cases worked out in my head, but I think there's smarter people than me that I hope are working on that problem. I think what we want to be concerned about is, as I said before, it's the human misuses of the tool, and we're going to have to make sure that there's consequences there for that. Some of that obviously falls on the individual who's misusing it, and some of it falls on the folks developing the models. Just like personally, I believe the social media platforms should be responsible for content there, some of which they're doing, some of which I think they could do a much more effective job of.
Well, this is obviously a controversial issue, Section 230, and the question of social media platform responsibility. One thing I forgot, Jamil, if I can add about the investor role, because we have a role too, and I think that's to make sure that the founders we're backing are ethical. So nothing's more important if you're making a decision about investment in a company than the people you're backing. So I think it's an extra responsibility if we're backing AI companies, but it probably applies to all technology, that the folks have very strong ethics and values. Yeah. I totally agree with you. And, your firm, Shield Capital, and my firm, Paladin Capital, have come together and with a group of other investors to sort of, ally around a set of trust, safety, and security principles. So there is a role, I think, for investors to play here, too. Natasha, I want to give you the last word here, though, right? So as we think about all these challenges, you've laid out a lot of important questions about bias and about the question of majoritarian views when it comes to the way these models are trained, right? And there is this question, of how much regulation will help or harm this, right? We've seen how sometimes over-indexing can cause, these LLMs to give us weird results that don't make any sense in the real world. So As you think about this place where you sit between research on one side and applied capabilities in a major technology company, how do you see the regulatory dynamic playing out? Are you worried about its effect on innovation? And at the end of the day, how do we ensure that this technology moves fast and that we remain at the forefront while ensuring that it's still trusted, safe, and secure?
That's a great question. I just should say I cannot formally comment on what regulation should be as a Google employee.
Of
Like
course.
they don't want me to do.
No, of course.
I guess I would say one thing that seems a reasonable approach would be to say, can we make the data sets that these models are trained on, as well as any alignment principles that they're trained on, transparent? So there's this movement to do like data sheets for data sets. Many big tech companies like NVIDIA are actually releasing open source data sets, these like large scale, internet scale data sets they use to train large language models, as well as data sets of human feedback that they use to do the alignment process. So to the extent that those are transparent and open source, then we can really audit, like, are these models trained on something that we don't want them to be ingesting or not? And I think that's a really great movement towards not only making the technology more widely available and democratizing it, but also making it safer.
Yeah, makes a lot of sense. All right, that's a wrap. Thank you to both Dr. Natasha Jaques from the University of Washington and Mike Brown from Shield Capital, formerly of DIU, for joining us today. And thank you to Keelan Wolf, Claude Jennings, and the entire NSI CTC staff for their help in producing today's episode. The Control F podcast, including our game-changing technology series, is also on YouTube, so be sure to check out NSI's page on YouTube for a video of today's episode. And make sure to join us for our next episode where we explore the complex world of quantum computing and how the utilization of quantum machines is changing the way we approach the world. And if you like what you heard, as always, or saw, be sure to rate, review, and subscribe.